Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the iBCI-CC Fundamentals webinar series. My name is Lee Hochberg, one of the organizers, together with Jen French, who's down there on my screen, and Jessica Kellerman, who's also right there on my screen. For those who are joining us for the first time, the Implantable Brain-Computer Interface Collaborative Community, which is semi-conveniently named the iBCI-CC, is composed of clinicians and researchers and people with regulatory expertise, patient advocates, people with lived experience of neurologic disease or injury, care partners, industry leaders, and others, all of whom really share a commitment to innovation and to wide access to implantable BCIs. The iBCI-CC is also proudly the first FDA participating collaborative community in the clinical neurosciences. And we're now, I'll let Jessica fact check me, I think 400 plus members strong, nodding. So yes, which is really amazing, but we want more. So if you have colleagues who are interested and would be interested in contributing to the collaborative community, please ask them to join. And for your convenience, we will shortly, if it's not already there, put a link in the chat to ibci-cc.org, where they can press the blue button in the upper right-hand corner and join. So our iBCI Fundamentals webinar series was created really to foster a common understanding of some of the key challenges and opportunities of the implanted BCI field. And our goal is to provide a kind of college 101 level introduction to complex topics, which, among other things, include device regulation and reimbursement and neural data privacy, hoping to build a shared knowledge base that's going to facilitate not only the iBCI-CC workgroup discussions, but also broader consensus across those work groups, and then ultimately on their way to be helpful as we think about all the important decisions being made for iBCIs. Today's webinar will be for iBCI-CC members, but it's also being recorded, might be edited a little bit if needed, and then it will be posted publicly on our website to ensure that the insights that are shared here today are accessible to a wider audience. Today's session is entitled Understanding the Market Opportunity for iBCIs. Now, for many BCI researchers, the topic of capital markets is far from usual fare. But as we know, it's really only with support from those capital markets that the final form of implantable BCIs are going to be developed and then tested in pivotal clinical trials. So in today's webinar, we're going to provide this 101 level insight into how investment and venture communities think about the commercial potential for implantable BCIs. Now, in full disclosure, when I first heard, or I guess read the word TAM, I thought about those fluffy velvet hats that get worn by faculty at university commencements. And it turns out that it actually has another meaning, which is entirely relevant to today's seminar. So I'm looking forward to learning a lot. We are thrilled to be joined by two fantastic speakers who are going to bring their complementary perspectives on investment in BCIs. First, we're going to hear from Kallum Titchmarsh, who's Vice President for U.S. Medical Technology Equity Research at Morgan Stanley, and was lead author of the firm's BCI Primer, which explores the market opportunities of BCIs. And after Kallum's presentation, we're going to hear from Dr. Amy Kruse, who's Chief Investment Officer at Satori Capital and Satori Neuro, and a neuroscientist by training. Amy brings deep expertise in neurotechnology investment and development, and will help to contextualize the report's findings for our iBCI community. As a reminder, because the iBCI-CC operates in a pre-competitive space, proprietary information about specific companies are not a topic of discussion for today, but our goal very much is to really to educate broadly and while avoiding any focus about the regulatory or reimbursement path for any specific company. We will leave time at the end for Q&A, so feel free to add your questions as we go to the Q&A box or to the chat box. Jessica can remind me which at the bottom. You probably have access to one of them, so put your questions in there. And with that, let's get started. So Kallum, I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, guys. Let me share my screen. Let me know if you can see the slides.
Yep, looks good.
Let me get this up full screen.
Yeah,
all good?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you for the team as well for hosting me today. Really appreciate the opportunity to chat about a really exciting topic for us. as I was introduced, Kallum Titchmarsh from the US MedTech team here at Morgan Stanley. Just a bit of background on myself before we get started. So I work as an equity analyst on Morgan Stanley's US MedTech team. I moved to New York last year, and before that, I was based in London at Bank of America covering European MedTech. So I joined the finance industry straight out of college, where I studied neuroscience. So I've been, taken some of those learnings from my college days to where I am today. I appreciate, many of you guys are probably less familiar with my job function. So I'll just briefly explain, what we do. Fundamentally, the role is to, advise clients, which, are typically institutional investors like asset managers or hedge funds, which stocks are attractive within our sector. And so the sector we cover obviously is medical technology. We have, a list of about 40 publicly traded companies where we have an active rating on it to, let investors know where they should be buying, selling, or holding on to that particular stock. As well as the company specific stuff we work on. We also like to analyze broader thematic trends in the market before they are relevant to the public markets. Example being this BCI topic. We haven't seen many public moves on the market side yet, but it's something that we thought was definitely worth exploring, and is something that 5 years from now we think has a very high likelihood of being in our public sphere. We also work with our investment bankers who obviously go through that transaction process with these private companies when they want to IPO or if they want to follow an offering. We help to vet the companies with the bankers, so we provide our analysis and opinions on whether we think, the decision that the bankers want to go ahead with is the right one. They don't always listen to us. It's sometimes not in their best interest to do so, but that's how we add value to the whole sphere. So I'm going to walk through today the report that we put out that many of you are probably aware of. Just to kind of kick off, I wanted to explain why we wrote this report. I think, as I mentioned, important part of the job is to keep an eye on broad industry-wide trends before they hit the market. We obviously engage with a lot of these stakeholders across the medtech sphere, and it was around mid-2024 we had the CEO of one of the large BCI players reach out just to provide us an intro with their technology. The email they sent across really caught our eye. This was new, innovative tech that we hadn't heard of before in our space. So we thought, worth taking the meeting and learning more about the topic. The reason this person reached out is because they had legitimate updates to share about the company. We saw a lot of news flow relating to BCIs in 2024, and what had initially started out to be in the public's eye as a Neuralink only market actually had multiple players, some of which were arguably further ahead than Neuralink themselves. And with that comes the clinical milestones, and we were seeing $100 million plus capital raises last year. So it was clear to us that the belief behind BCIs was growing. And if we are to spend our time digging into a market, we want to dive into topics that interest us fundamentally. And for me, studying neuroscience at college, and now having stock coverage in the neurovascular space, it makes a lot of sense for us to push here and to learn more. So that is the kind of background and rationale behind why we wrote the report. So next, we're going to be talking about what we learn, and trying to condense it down into short slides, given there's so much to talk about here. Short answer was a lot. I think the assumption that most people seem to have is that, at least in the investment community, is that the BCIs are, really new topic, maybe, 10 to 20 years old. What we really wanted to highlight in our report is, the fundamental science and understanding behind the devices we're seeing today, stretches back way further than that. We called out some of the work from Hans Berger, capturing the first human EEGs back in the 1920s. And honestly, it felt kind of fitting doing this report 100 years later to where we're at today, so far down the innovation timeline. We were Also interested to see the varied approaches taken by competitors to develop BCIs. There are many different arguments we heard on levels of invasiveness, whether you then need to trade off that invasiveness for the amount of data you can generate. Some competitors were, seemingly leveraging existing surgical techniques to insert their BCIs into patients. Others were developing more novel techniques. And in medtech, we see quite commonly a lot of Me Too devices in the market. But I think we were impressed in the BCI space to see so much diversity amongst the development techniques. And while we didn't highlight or won't be doing that today, highlighting the company we feel is best positioned in the market, there were a lot of passionate thoughts and opinions out there, as I'm sure you're well aware. With that diversity, obviously comes debate on what counts as a BCI. We've heard multiple definitions flying around, and we really struggled to pin down a description that we were comfortable with. I know there was an elevated amount of debate on this later in 2024, so it's clear that more work still needs to be done here. Which kind of leads me to the last point on regulatory support. We did speak with quite a few key stakeholders from the FDA who had been working on, pinning down these definitions and supporting some of the largest companies on their clinical trial design. What was clear to us is that, a lot more work needs to be done behind the scenes regarding regulation to, enable these devices to be approved in an efficient and safe way. This is obviously a very specialist area, and to successfully launch these kind of devices, you really need competent regulatory infrastructure behind it to support that. So what did we conclude? So let's talk about some of the numbers we came out with, and TAM obviously being the phrase we refer to as total addressable market. We spent a lot of time digging across sources, and we spoke with multiple physicians here as well, just to sense check some of the numbers we concluded with on incidence rates of specific diseases and how the severity of patients within that disease spectrum differs too. Our assumption, is that the first wave of implantable BCIs will be used to improve the quality of life for those suffering from severe critical upper limb impairment. We also added epilepsy and depression, both of which we felt could be managed to a degree with BCI technology, depending on how you define it. Given that definition debate, we broke down a TAM both with and without the depression and epilepsy pools, just to help cater for all the audiences. So for BCIs targeting the upper limb impairment, we assumed an ASP of about $60,000, and that was based on discussions we had with competitors, regulators, and also referencing some comparable medtech reimbursement that we see today. Taking that 60K ASP with the critically upper limb impaired population gave us a total addressable market of about $9.3 billion. When you then layer on top of that the epilepsy and depression population, which we're assuming a slightly lower ASP of about 25K, your TAM can then push up to over $80 billion just in this early phase alone. Both of these numbers will add a just US. The prevalence of these conditions is obviously multiples above this when looking away from just the domestic market. One thing that is probably worth talking about is these rollouts can take some time. We use some of the learnings from other med device rollouts like spinal cord stimulation, deep brain stimulation, and some as well on the cardiovascular side to just plot how we think adoption of BCIs will look. Perhaps a touch conservative, but we're expecting a commercial rollout for BCIs, in that early TAM from around 2030, so about 4.5 years away. We're encouraged to see the initial implants in patients from some of the leading players, but I think these numbers are going to have to increase quite meaningfully, before the FDA will allow for a wider launch with an attractive label to that. It'll obviously also take time to develop these devices and the algorithms to actually be useful beyond just basic functions. And once those are in play, we think patient willingness will also shoot up quite meaningfully, which again is what you need for one of these launches. So by 2035, we think the early BCI population would have generated revenue of about $1.2 billion from the initial implant procedure. That number comes down to about $700 million when you exclude that epilepsy and depression pool. Of those patients with critical upper limb impairment, that would imply about 9% penetration of your early target market. That's actually at a faster rate of penetration than we see across many traditional med device rollouts. I think the reason for that is the tech here is really addressing an unmet need for extremely sick patients. So we think there is an opportunity to penetrate the market quicker than we've traditionally seen in med tech. We also spend some time just calculating how many patients suffer from these conditions at a lower severity level. So kind of moderate forms of impairment where a BCI could still be used to improve the quality of life. This is, where the big numbers really sit with our, analysis points into just under 7 million individuals in the US who could benefit from a BCI outside of that early critical pool. One implant in each of these patients would drive accumulated revenues of about $300 billion, which is, an absurd number, obviously, but something that, certainly could be achieved across the long run. And just, here's an illustration of how we think the annual BCI market revenue will trend, assuming that 2030 approval. We have many medtech end markets now generating north of $1 billion per year. But our assumptions actually think that it's probably going to take around 11 years for the BCI space to hit that $1 billion run rate. You may be wondering why there's a slight growth inflection from 2040. We think the driver of that will be the expansion into the less severe indications and broadening out the applicable patient pool. Obviously, it will take time to evidence success in the initial cohort. And again, maybe 10 years for an indication expansion is too conservative, but that's where we felt comfortable checking out based on some feedback we had from payers. And this can be a fairly invasive procedure, but it's not just the regulators that will want to see success in the initial group of patients, but the general population too. I think once that is tried and tested, you could legitimately argue that having a BCI in these patients could be driving true benefits. And then just 15 years post rollout, we've got a little pie chart down here. We think about 270,000 individuals by 2045 will have received a BCI. That equates to about $10 billion of revenue generated. Obviously, that's a blend of ASPs across your critical limb impairment and then your epilepsy and depression patients too. And again, we'd highlight that this initial number really only highlights the first revenue you could generate from that one implant procedure. There may be software replacement cycles as well that could be considered to drive the revenue up even more, which we typically see in neuromodulation end markets like spinal cord stim. And lots of numbers flying about. So just wanted to break down our estimates in a bit of a clearer detail. Feel free to screenshot this slide, but it's all locked up in the report. So for each indication, we've split the US patient pool in the early and intermediate TAMs with an implied dollar value based on the initial implant procedure. In the two columns on the far right, we've also added how much we think each indication will generate in revenue in 2035 and then 2045. For amputation, just for what it's worth, you might see the NA there. We just think the early TAM is the full TAM, given there isn't a broad spectrum to consider of severity when you're amputated. It's either amputated or it's not. Of the kind of non-epilepsy or depression conditions, we think stroke, spinal cord injury, and amputation will be the three largest revenue contributors within the BCI sphere by 2045, though the ALS cohort will be the most penetrated. Just shifting away from numbers now and onto some key considerations that we had after writing this report. That what are some of the things we think are crucial to consider when rolling out med devices like this to the market? Again, focusing on the US here, but appreciate that this will run globally, and a lot of these concepts are applied wherever you are based in the world. I guess firstly, the question we have in medtech is who's going to be performing these procedures, and are there enough surgeons to fulfill demand? So we connected with multiple neurosurgeons and spoke to them about this topic. There seems to be really high demand amongst them for elective procedures. These are obviously surgeons that spend a lot of time on call in the ICU. BCIs would allow them to be, more structured, planned, have these procedures implemented within their schedules. We also run the math on how many surgeons we expect to train on BCI implantation over time in the US versus procedure demand. Yeah, and we were comfortable calculating there weren't going to be any capacity concerns here. Just so our 2035 market revenue numbers imply about 11,000 BCI implant procedures in the year. We think by then about 400 of the 4,000 board certified neurosurgeons in the US would have trained on the BCI implant procedure, or at least one of the many techniques, across the space. So that's about 2 implants per month for each of these 400 surgeons, which we think seems totally feasible. Second thing we'd bring up is patient willingness. That's really important as well in medtech. Does a patient want an implant inside their body, particularly in the brain? We think so. Like we said, we're obviously talking about some of the sickest individuals here with severe quality of life impairments. If these devices are proven safe and efficacious, we'd expect patient willingness to be relatively high in our target markets. We've actually since we put the note out, we've seen some really compelling data from the BCI players who have conducted their own research into this topic, and that helped to validate our opinion on patient willingness being relatively high. And again, our revenue assumptions aren't really assuming a rapid uptake here versus some of the things we've seen elsewhere in medtech. So we think we have balanced that patient willingness with still some degree of conservatism as well. And then obviously the FDA, we can't ignore that. That's obviously going to be a super important part of the BCI market as it grows and scales. We touched on it earlier, but I think the BCI community really needs to continue helping the FDA better understand this tech. That then should enable your better trial design discussions, more efficient approval pathways, which should then allow for better adoption of this technology. We've actually seen quite a few workshops hosted by the FDA with BCI competitors, which we were really encouraged by. And while we think there's, I think, a bit more stability now, we were a bit apprehensive when some of the recent cuts were announced at the FDA because, this area in particular is so specialist. You really want to keep these people involved. It's not like you can just openly source them from the market. It's a really niche space that needs these kind of people behind it to support approvals. And then just wanted to chat about the response actually, and kind of why I'm here today was we obviously like to think our work is impactful, but we were really blown away by the response magnitude from this report. It actually became one of the most read research reports within Morgan Stanley for the whole of 2024. And that only included reads online on the Morgan Stanley portal. I saw it all over LinkedIn, which must have spread the recognition even more so. We must have had, I think, about 100 plus individuals reach out across the BCI community, picked up by many news outlets, and we ran multiple interviews on this topic. On the back of that, we also had a lot of invitations to attend events like this one. And I think I was really pleased to see how scaled yet well connected the BCI community is. And given a lot of the job is occupied with public market activity, we couldn't commit all our time to BCIs, but we were really pleased with how the report landed. I think, on the criticism side, there was a few that resonated with us. We did have multiple players reach out to let us know that the ASP assumptions we had, the average selling price was too low. And we obviously won't specify who or how much they thought a reasonable ASP was, but it was comfortably ahead of the 60K that we'd assumed. If some suggested as well that the patients included in our TAM was too broad, particularly if we were accounting for depression and epilepsy, but also some on the less severely limb impaired side as well. Apparently, some of our numbers there may have been a bit aggressive. And obviously, we had a lot of companies asking us why they weren't included. We tried to be inclusive where possible. I think it's clear some of the players need to do a better job at marketing themselves online, but I think we captured enough to create a healthy debate. And just to conclude really with what's next for us, clearly, we are trying to stay engaged with the BCI community. We've now had multiple discussions with the companies competing in the space, and I'm really glad now that investors have started to ask us questions on how they can best allocate capital into the space. Um, I think the majority of the responses to the report from the investment community, I would say like 80% were, that is interesting to us, but it's a bit far out. We did have a solid, 20% of our, 4,000 clients that reached out with genuine investment questions. So again, this goes back to wanting to identify these trends before they become actionable in the public markets. We think we help to hopefully propel that. We obviously want to continue writing about BCIs based on the response. Even since the report back in October, there's been quite a few capital raises announced. And I think, as I said, it's plausible we could be talking about public BCI companies within the next 4.5, 5 years. We have also been speaking about BCIs with existing medtech companies in the public sphere. So, some of your largest names out there, they have already expressed interest in this space. A lot of them play in neuromodulation. It is somewhat, similar to that pool. So we are going to try and continue educating them too, because we obviously, as we cover them, spend a lot of time chatting to them about new things we find interesting. So I think that's enough from me. I think, Amy, now you're going to give a bit of commentary on the report, followed by a bit of Q&A. Just a heads up, we can only really comment on what's been publicly written based on the job. So some of the questions I might have to avoid, but hopefully we answered enough of them in the report. Thank you.
Great. Kallum, thanks very much. That was a great overview, and I know really educational to our iBCI-CC community. And with that, just as you said, we'll hand over to Amy for your perspective.
Yeah, thank you for that. And mercifully, because I'm doing a commentary, I don't have any slides. So, so first of all, thanks to the iBCI collaborative community for bringing the discussion together. And, I think it's super exciting to be at this stage as a community. And of course, Kallum, thank you and your team at Morgan Stanley for putting together such a fantastic report and really sharing it with all of us. I think it's enormously important. And, for those of you that don't know me, my background's neuroscience, and started out my career, PhD in neuroscience, started out my career as a government program manager at DARPA, leading a variety of programs using neuroscience and neuroscience technology for human performance. And I'll touch on that at the end. Have had a fun career, a trajectory through sort of the defense world, was an entrepreneur, a co-founder of a startup, and then moved into venture investing, where I've been both actively investing in neurotechnology, brain-computer interfaces, neuromodulation, as well as what's happening in new molecules in mental health. And so that's part of the work that I do, leading up a new fund at Satori Capital called Satori Neuro. And so I think, I think Kallum gave a pretty good framing, right? While the report is obviously touching on a lot of things, it was definitely written with kind of the investor's eye in mind, which I think is really, really critical. And so from my perspective as an investor, the report was enormously helpful because it gives us an independent perspective on, this important and growing area. And so I think that having someone from outside of the community come back and look into what's happening, and again acknowledging that it wasn't sort of everything that was happening, but really some of the market leaders, was really really useful. The title of the report is brain computer interfaces the next big med tech opportunity? I think absolutely. And I think it's a little bit more than just another med tech opportunity. And I'm going to make a couple of comments sort of around that. And I think, those of us in this space really feel strongly, I certainly feel strongly, that brain computer interfaces will become the way to interface with the brain and correct a variety of different conditions that cannot be adequately addressed through pharmaceuticals. And so, while some people might have argued that the TAMs were too big, the unmet need is so massive in this space. I think there's certainly a debate to be had around if the TAMs were too small. That said, I certainly agree that the first place that we'll see these devices used is in, sort of the motor impairment or repair, domains, and those will be the first markets addressed. I like to give, especially as we put this in context, I like to give a little bit of a why now for something that those of us who've been in this space and know that it's been, at least from the implanted BCI world, has been going on for a couple of decades. I think there are three things for me that have evolved and changed, kind of radically over the last 2 decades and certainly decades. So I think we are finally seeing neurotech catch up with Moore's law. So I think a lot of what you're seeing is the manifestation of using and applying these microelectronic systems that can be both machined as well as created. The electronics themselves, we now have systems that can be, completely worn on the head or in the human, and I think that's pretty massive. I think one thing, and this will be a thread that runs through this, is that I call it from synapses to systems level of thinking. We are really at a place now where we're starting to understand the brain and be able to describe it from a network level perspective, which matches perfectly with brain-computer interfaces and how we can modulate those systems and modulate those networks, which is not just about readout, but potentially, putting energy and information in as well. And then I think one of the things that, that certainly maybe a slower evolution, but to me is a pretty broad opportunity is sort of what I call like the miracle of neuroplasticity, right? When I was in graduate school, sort of adult brains didn't change that much. And now I think, through the use of neuromodulatory systems and other brain-computer interfaces, we really understand that the brain has the capacity to change itself, and that opens up a lot. And then I think there are two things that I would add to the why now. So I call it the what else. And I think one of the things is part of what was hit on in the report and part of what we know as a community, that we're really in the implementation and engineering phase of this field. So while to the public, brain-computer interfaces might look like science fiction, those of us in the community know that a lot of the science has been accomplished in labs and clinical research for decades. And so, I think one of the areas that gives us great confidence around this space is that, we as a community know these solutions work. The second piece, and this is something I've been thinking about quite a bit lately, is the notion of biomarkers. And so, while we've been focused a lot on getting signal out for what I might call task or intent-based recording, I think there's a lot of data in those signals and in those humans' brains, and I think that results in an enormous opportunity in this space. And so that, I think, is something that we, as we look forward and perhaps, think about the way that the field and these systems will evolve, will be something to look at. And so one of the things that I like to emphasize with brain-computer interfaces is their platform potential. So this is not your father's med tech, as I like to say, where a pacemaker does one thing and sort of one thing only. The companies that are developing these systems might start out targeting one addressable market or condition, but there's nothing fundamentally about the technology that limits how and where it can be used in the brain, especially as it relates to implanted technologies. So I would like to, highlight, perhaps in, spurring some ideas here for Kallum and his team about things that are emerging and may expand the space even further. And certainly while depression was mentioned in the report, therapeutic implanted BCIs can cover a wide range of mental health conditions and are on the horizon. Depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, and sort of what we might call other network-based conditions are prime candidates for these types of interventions. One thing that, again, not covered in the report, but I really would love to see a discussion evolve around is neurodegenerative conditions. So right now we see that deep brain systems, deep brain stimulation systems are moving to closed loop, so stimulate and record. And even, companies like Medtronic are billing themselves as therapeutic BCI companies, sort of trying to be like us cool kids. These large companies, and perhaps Kallum referenced their interest in this space, will need to upgrade their systems from decades old tech to keep up with these private companies that are emerging. I think that's a really interesting space. And then additionally, with the biomarkers, particularly blood-based biomarkers, as we're now seeing in the neurodegenerative space and have recently been announced for Alzheimer's, there may be an opportunity to intervene with brain-computer interfaces as memory system support or other interventions. And certainly, there are startups that have been working in those spaces. And then not mentioned, but I think another area of evolution and very kind of interest is drug device combinations, where you have these powerful biomarkers available. This potentially presents a new area and new engagement for pharma, especially those heavily invested in CNS or in psychiatry. And so, because neurotech and BCI has such platform potential, I think one of the things we haven't yet fully explored is the application space. And so I do suspect we will see a big expansion of software technology to support these systems. And I believe that patients will be asking for them. To date, with patients, certainly with implants in clinical trials, I think they've been somewhat limited in what they can accomplish with those implants. And I predict that the industry around these implants will grow as well. And I think, Kallum, in the report, you mentioned that you sort of didn't talk about the software space, didn't talk about some of those elements, but I do think that's relevant. For example, Apple, doesn't make all the applications for its phone; other developers do. And so what I'd like to pose, like, what is the App Store for the future BCI? And then I'd love to end on a couple of final topics, a little bit spicy because I get to do the commentary. So IPOs. So Kallum referred to that, initial public offerings. Traditionally in medtech, we don't see many companies IPO until they're in revenue, which is actually something that's dramatically different from pharma. And I might argue that it might be time to change that with neurotech and BCI. And I think that the future of BCI, the future we are talking about here, depends on strong standalone neurotechnology companies, both for getting their products into the market and for sustaining the robust early stage R&D and early stage startups that will build future products. So I would, in our group, we think gen in tech, not med tech. We're creating a new field here. So that's one thing I'd like to throw out there for folks who are thinking about investment and the maturation of these companies. AI. There is a growing conversation in the AI and computational neuroscience space that BCIs will provide the much needed data to take AI to the next level. I don't know if this is right. I don't know if it's wrong. But I do suspect that it's exceptionally valuable data about the most complex AI that we know about today, which is the human brain. And if AI is on the table, and big tech gets even more interested, I suggest or say that maybe we've slipped the bounds of med tech and might be headed someplace more interesting and intriguing. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And then finally, as I mentioned, I would make a little bit of commentary around human performance. And so, I was the program manager who ran and started a whole range of human performance programs and DARPA, so maybe a little bit qualified to talk about this. I do see this as a not today, meaning today topic, but I don't think it's as far out as 20 years. I actually think it's much closer. I think that once we have BCIs and a whole variety of them, as we're describing in the marketplace in patients, the application space will open up. Humans are very clever, as we all know, and so you might see patients with unmet needs taking on the role of superhumans first, not soldiers. And with the general slowness of the I would say larger U.S. military to adopt any performance boosting cognitive or brain technology, I think it would take something fairly dramatic to speed that up. Perhaps an adversary using the tech, I don't know, something else. But, I use the example, look how quickly the war in Ukraine changed the conversation around drones, and perhaps there's an equivalent here. So not trying to be too spicy around that, but just trying to say in terms of that type of use, really not seeing anything in the nearest term. And so it was a delight to be a part of this conversation, and personally as well as sort of professionally. And I think we are really excited about being part of this much larger conversation, which I see as not only around brain-computer interfaces for medical, med tech and med technology, but also this much broader neurotechnology field and the evolution of it to date. And I think how it's growing and will continue to grow and keeping that vibrant and healthy. So those are my comments, and happy to continue the conversation.
Wow. Well, thank you, Amy, for that really both neuroscientifically inspired and both market-based and provocative, as promised, kind of description of what some of the future could hold for these technologies. What I'm going to do is I'm going to perhaps take that last part of Amy's presentation and request that we move that to a different discussion at a different time, which is, although they're very much part of the iBCI-CC work groups and thinking particularly about how some of these technologies may be used in a non-medical realm in the future. But at least for today's discussion, only in the interest of time, and because we have lots of questions, we're likely going to stay focused on the first 9/10 of what both Amy
no
and
worries, but I couldn't resist putting it in there. So
and it's part of why you were invited. So thank you. But there's lots of great questions and Kallum as well. Thanks for kicking us off. Let me turn over to Jen French to guide us through our Q&A.
Thanks, Lee, and thanks to Kallum and Amy. You guys had a great presentation, and thanks for bringing this topic to the iBCI-CC. I love this topic of the investor side and really understanding, what the business case is for iBCIs. So I just wanted to take a little creative liberty as a panelist and be able to ask the first question, even though we have lots of questions in the chat. So just to give you a little context, I mean, Kallum, you mentioned in the report, you talked to surgeons, you were looking at about 400 surgeons implanting about 2 per month. And that's how you came about that. But, one of the challenges in neurotech is clinical adoption. So to both of you, I guess my first question is, how do you wrap around your head around clinical adoption, where it's not just the surgeon that's implanting, but it might be some other treating physicians down the line? And from an investor perspective, how do you look at that and kind of how do you calculate that into prices and valuations, if you will? So, Kallum, maybe you can pick us up with that question.
Yeah, I think for us, it all comes down to the data that you can generate, and this is the topic here is. It's interesting. We've when we were speaking with the regulators, we heard some struggling to define how to assess efficacy of these devices. Safety is relatively simple to illustrate. Have you had an adverse event? Have you not? But here, I think the physicians we spoke with care a lot about seeing the data out of the initial implants that we have and whether they're successful. And we've seen some videos around. I think the broad scaling of those studies and the generation of more data will help. We are planning, and I think one important thing that we've seen, and we spent some time with Mount Sinai here in New York. They are broadening out their BCI program. They're actively implanting the devices today. I think a lot of it as well would be word of the mouth. I think with our experience with neurosurgeons is they are very keen to try new technologies when they hit the market, at least relative to other doctors that we chat with, perhaps on the cardiology side. So I really think if you have the compelling data there, you have physicians that are eager and excited, and I think in neurotech you do, then I think that is a good recipe for a good rollout. And to be honest, the numbers we put out there aren't too aggressive, we think. I think by 2035, you'll have from now another 10 years to educate, to generate that data. And that really gets you to a point where a couple of these a month, I think, would be good for physicians that don't have enough elective procedures within their schedule.
Yeah. Amy?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say around that, obviously agree with what Kallum said. I do think we're starting to see the development of centers of excellence in this space. And I think, entities that are really looking to lead and will help define, how these networks work in terms of, patients getting interested, access to the surgeries and things like that. So I think, part of what we might see as a rollout is, sort of centers of excellence as a way to do that. And then several of the companies that we're involved in, the question is now how to communicate with patients, how to connect them with surgeons and people in the community. I think, obviously the iBCI-CC is addressing some of those questions, and I think they are yet to be addressed. But I do think we'll see the centers of excellence take the lead in getting these things initially out there for sure.
Great, thanks. So, so let's lead to our questions in the chat. Like I said, there's a lot of them, and there's some really good nuggets in here. So, one of our first questions comes from Andreas, and the question is that, assuming that 60K is our starting ASP, can you unpack what's included with that cost and what's excluded for a successful implantation? And B, do you expect the ASP to remain fixed over that 20 years out to the period of 2045? Or will there be economies of scale and or pressures from payers to reduce the cost in order to scale to larger populations?
Yeah, so I appreciate the ASP debate is very fluid. I would say our assumption, like we said, we spend time with some of the companies involved. We spend time with some of the payers. You have devices out there in the market like cochlear implants today. They are costing about $100,000. Your reimbursement slightly above that. So, our assumption in the BCI space, I think 60K is a reasonable place to begin with. That is obviously encompassing all of the hardware involved, which isn't a huge amount, but also the back end technology supporting these products, which is it's harder to put a figure on. Typically in the medtech space, we see gross margins for the companies, around the 70 to 80% place at scale. Do I think there will be opportunity to push prices up over time? Yeah, I think so. Obviously, you will need comfortable reimbursement in place beforehand, because if the hospitals themselves or the centers are operating on tight margins once they account for that product cost, then the companies aren't going to be too willing to be pushing price up, because that could be pushing your procedure demand down for the docs. They want to be compelled to perform this procedure too. So I think assuming there is a reasonable margin for the centers, for the facilities, then with justified innovation, you can keep ticking prices up. But for some markets we see in medtech, the margins are so tight, you just don't have that room to maneuver. So it all depends on how the payers think, and how reimbursement looks, I think.
Yeah. Amy, any thoughts on that and the ASPs?
I'm in the camp that I thought it was a little low. Thinking about the price of a cochlear implant or even an implanted defibrillator and things that provide an enormous amount of value. I do agree, though, that tacking it onto the earlier conversation, I think that there's a lot to be said for efficacy and the outcomes that these devices provide. And I think the greater the range of outcomes that these devices provide, I think that could support certainly a higher ASP. But definitely don't think it's any lower than than what was included. And then I also, maybe just to make a comment on the thing that I said, I don't know I don't think we've priced out what the software stack and what the surrounding stack around that looks like. I think, Kallum, you mentioned in the report there may be recurring revenue costs that come with those systems or upgrades to those systems, and so. I think that's a TBD, but I think that's also a potential source of revenue as well, in addition to just the device.
Yeah, great. So staying on that same theme, Jean had asked the question about the payer assumptions. So what are some of those payer assumptions that are underlying these ASPs? And are we considering, government insurance programs, private insurers, pay out of pocket? What are some of those considerations when we're looking at payers?
Yeah, I mean, typically we see Medicare, kick it off. That obviously factors in a select cohort. Typically for our med devices, you want that commercial coverage to really broaden your TAM out. So I think, initially we'll see Medicare jump on. The payers on the commercial side, really what they want to see is good data to then broaden out their coverage policies to factor in, and broaden out to BCIs. The issue we're kind of having is, given how diverse some of these techniques are in the BCI space, method of implantation, mechanism of action, I don't know where it's going to be easy to just coin one, reimbursement rate for them all. I think it's going to be very diverse. So that's something we have to think about. There are cases in the medtech space where out of pocket is considered. Again, but these devices are expensive, but they are targeting a very sick cohort of patients that could have real quality of life improvements. But we would really want to see broad, not just Medicare, but commercial payers covering this to assume that broad uptake that we've factored into our report.
So one of the questions also came in, you addressed payers and some of the concerns about payers, but you also mentioned about FDA. So from addressing Zach's question that came in, you mentioned FDA knowledge around BCIs can be improved. What do you think FDA needs to better understand to promote the progress and growth of implantable BCIs and in the field? Where do you think those knowledge gaps are in our regulator space?
Definition is one, I think. They do have some definitions floating around on what a BCI is, but I think that needs improvement. Again, coming to the heterogeneity of the space, I think it's something they need to work on whether they want a fixed definition or something that is somewhat flexible and open to not just one mechanism of action, not just one implantation method, but broader out. I think that's something that needs to be worked on. Again, I'd go back to the efficacy side as well, how you're really judging the efficacy of these devices. It's something that the docs we think will want to see on paper. I know the videos are helpful, but they want to see stuff on paper before that adoption broadens out. So I think those two are important. I think those two are the ones we'd probably highlight mostly of where the gaps are at today. We also
Amy, any thoughts
struggled.
on?
I would just say we also struggled finding, when we were like searching for people to chat with, there just weren't that many. I think, like I said, it's such a niche space. I think we may need to broaden out, who we are using within the FDA to help support the BCI rollout. Maybe broaden out to the neuromod guys. I know there are specialists there that focus on that. I just think it's now too much weight is being placed on a select few people within the FDA. So I guess with the momentum we're seeing in the BCI space, we hope that broadens out so you can support a good commercial launch once it's ready.
Amy, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I would just say broadly that the FDA has been very supportive of our efforts. The community's efforts in the BCI space, I think, have been very forward looking. They're folks from the larger community and have been through a lot of the, organizations that a lot of us have worked at or worked with. And so, I do think, always, I mean, unfortunately, we're probably not in an environment of increasing headcount, but, have really, enjoyed and benefited from the support of the FDA. They really do show up at the meetings and open dialogue with folks. And so I would obviously love that for that to continue, and agree with Kallum if that could expand a bit. I know that, maybe in the psychiatric space, as these devices move into that area, they may be covered by some of those individuals as well outside of the motor impairment domain. So.
Yeah. Just speaking of the markets that we're trying to understand, a lot of this report had focused on within the US. Just wondering if you have any commentary around BCI companies and their potential OUS, as well as other companies that are outside of US addressing the US market. So
Yeah,
curious
tough for us to comment too much on that, just because it wasn't particularly included in the report. But I would say we had, I think 3 or 4 players from Europe reach out on the back of our report. Not all of them were implantable BCIs. I was surprised, honestly. I mean, I come from the UK. I can talk badly on it to a degree, but the innovation rate in the US just seems so far ahead what I've seen in the rest of Europe. But actually, I was surprised when we put the report out to have a lot of incoming from European investors as well. So I think there's certainly interest there. I again focused on the US just because our client base is primarily US, and the reimbursement dynamics here are very different to what you get in the Europe as well. I think that's kind of how we would shake out, all I can probably say, given what we published.
Amy,
Yeah.
any thoughts?
Yeah. I would just make a comment from the international space. I would say that certainly brain-computer interfaces are of deep, sort of international interest. We've seen both national, level interest from countries as well as investment in these spaces. The ARIA program out of the UK, Jacques Carolin's program, Precision Neurotechnologies, just kicked off this year with a 65 million pound investment in that area. And so I think we're going to see increasing both investment in the European space as well as broad global interest in this area. I don't think there's anything particularly special about the U.S. Unmet need in these U.S. populations versus other geographies, and I think that's one of the exciting things about the space. So
Yeah. So one of the questions as we're coming up, I just want to touch on one topic that is of importance to the iBCI-CC is public messaging. So a question was around, the biggest headline around this report was on, the BCI market being worth $400 billion in the US alone. Can you explain how that number comes from the numbers that were shown in the report, and what that headline might be, and how we might be able to improve our messaging as we look at public messaging within the iBCI-CC?
Sure. So that includes 2.8 million patients in your early TAM, so those sick, critically impaired patients with the upper limbs, and then those epilepsy and depression patients. And then it's 6.8 million in your moderate impairment of the upper limbs. Then multiply that by your ASP. Obviously, that's a mix of that 60K and 25K. That then gets you to the $400 billion.
Okay, great. That from the report. Now, Amy, of course, you've been adding commentary on this. Can you add a little commentary about, what we might consider and some of the considerations we need to take in iBCI-CC around the public messaging, particularly when it comes from, an investor standpoint?
yeah, I mean, I'm a think big kind of gal. So I do think that while there's certainly a reason when one is, doing their budgets and very inward facing things to be somewhat conservative. I do think that from an outward facing perspective, especially, interfacing with investors as well as people that may serve as later stage capital investors in this space. Obviously, Kallum is primarily focused on public markets, but also you can see how that system works, right? Like people get excited and then, so I would just say, I think there's, certainly as we all, I think we're a pretty, relatively conservative bunch in the, internal to the community. And so I think maybe a little exuberance is not unwarranted in this space as we see these numbers and as we start to think about where we're headed. I mean, if you think about the market cap of Intuitive Surgical or Medtronic or these are big, these are $100 billion market caps. And I think, while we're not going to end up there tomorrow, right? Like, I think that's the path that we're on, and it's up to us to help create it. So.
Great. Well, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Lee to close us out and ask one question. So again, thank you, Amy and Kallum, for your commentary and answering. There's so many questions, and again, my apologies for not getting to all the questions that were in the chat. Lee?
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. And thank you both to Kallum and Amy. Just an amazing discussion. I learned a ton, and there are lots more really good questions that I wish we had time for. We are going to collect those questions. We're going to see if Amy and Kallum can and will and might be willing to answer a few of them in short form for us to post or spread in other ways, or maybe they'll just tell us no, in which case we'll save the questions for some other time. But we'll at least ask offline. And I can say, just to wrap today, that we do have our next iBCI-CC Foundations webinar scheduled. It is going to be Wednesday, August 13th at noon Eastern. That is going to be on privacy and neural data from somebody who's truly an expert in this realm and in the legal aspects of medical information, sensitive information privacy. So we're really looking forward to that. think that will just about do it for today. I'm going to look to our true boss, Jessica Kellerman, to see if there's anything else to be said to wrap us for today.
Yep, I think you wrapped it up well.
All right. So with that, then, thank you all for joining us for today's seminar and webinar. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. To everybody in the IBCI-CC participating in the work groups, thank you for all of the hard work that you are doing. We really are making an impact on this field together, and really look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.